Hello, welcome everybody to the ARC, to the Advanced Research Centre. My name is Zara, I work here at the university and I just wanted to welcome you all. We are really excited to be the official hub for Glasgow Doors Open Day. We are a brand new building, so we're newly open, so this has been perfectly planned for us. And the Glasgow Doors Open Day festival actually overlaps with our own festival that you might have noticed called Arcadia. So we're delighted to have events as part of the Doors Open Day, and our events will continue for the next 2 weeks, including a talk today about this building. So if you're interested in architecture, design, and also what actually happens in this building upstairs, lots of different research going on, then please do come along at 3. Also worth mentioning, we do have an outdoor ceilidh happening at 1 p.m. today. So if you've got your dancing shoes on, it's a lovely day. Please do check that out. And there's a food truck selling pizza too. So there's a lot happening, and I'm sure you'll have a great day. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Zara. Hi everyone, how are you? My name's Stephen Sheriff. I'm the Events and Development Coordinator for Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. GBPT is a charitable property developer, and we rescue, repair and return to their communities buildings at risk across the city. Since 1990, we've also been delivering the festival, and we do that in partnership with the Scottish Civic Trust, the national coordinator for the event. Doors Open Days is in every region in Scotland now, so I encourage you to have a look at the programme. There'll be one more weekend after this, I believe, and venture out and see what else Scotland has to offer. We are very grateful to the university for hosting us in this amazing building. Thank you to Zara, to Cassie, Dylan and to Ken Skeldon, who have been working alongside us to realise this event. Thanks also goes to the tech team here at the ARC and to Ed Buckley, who's here with us tonight, this morning, making sure that everything goes well. During the digital festival in 2020, we broadcast our lecture programme over the internet and found it was really, really successful, opening up the festival to be more accessible to people across the world. We had people tuning in from. So it's something that we're continuing to do while speakers maybe aren't as keen of delivering lectures on Zoom. The audience is still there. So we're broadcasting this lecture on our Facebook channel and Twitter, straight to our website. And you'll also be able to pick it up on the YouTube channel after this. So if anyone, any of your pals who might be interested in this but they weren't able to come along today, please do let them know that it's there. I'd like to say a really huge thank you to our supporters: Glasgow City Council, the Arlington Baths, Page Park, Gardner and Theobald, and all of the sponsors up on the screen here who make this event possible. Like many cultural events, Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival is still struggling to recover from the effects of the pandemic. So we do have a wee donations box at the door, and if you fancy a snazzy t-shirt, they are also available, and volunteers will be able to help you with that. Just a couple of health and safety things to run through with you before we get started. The fire doors are to the rear and then across the exhibition floor and the fire doors at the back, and the assembly point is in the courtyard at the back. The toilets are to the right, next to the arch, but there are also toilets around this way as well. If anyone needs any assistance during the event, just make yourself known to myself or one of our volunteers, and I will do what I can to assist you. Okay, so on to the main event. Stuart Baird is a chartered civil engineer with a keen interest in transport and civil engineering heritage. He's founder and chair of the Scottish Roads Archive, formerly Glasgow Motorway Archive, the largest private collection of roads and transportation records in Scotland. An independent organisation managed by volunteers, its aim is to locate, preserve and share these unique artefacts and promote a wider understanding of the significant civil engineering projects behind them. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Baird.
Yep. Oh, That's us. Yep, brilliant. Thanks for coming along this afternoon. Who knew so many people were interested in motorway history? It's good to see. So yeah, and thanks to Stephen as well for all the organising that he's done and for having us along again this year. It's wonderful to be back in person, talking to people face to face, and of course, welcome to those watching online as well on the stream. I hope you will enjoy it. And what a fantastic facility this is. I must admit, I hadn't really been in the West End much over the last couple of years, but to come in and see all this wonderful new development, it really is quite fantastic. I'll be talking for about 40 minutes, there or thereabouts, a fairly informal presentation, and then we'll have some time for some questions at the end, hopefully as well. Hopefully you'll maybe have some. Okay, so that image sums up pretty well, in my opinion, the Glasgow motorway system, the Kingston Bridge. And when the Doors Open Days guys told us that the subject or the theme this year was city in flux, there's no one thing that shows a city in flux than that period in the 1960s and 70s when everything was changing and we were building mega projects like this. And the Kingston Bridge is obviously a pretty good example of the change that came about at that time. Now, the big question you're probably all asking, because it's the question I get asked the most at every event I ever go to, why is there a motorway running right through the centre of Glasgow? Yeah, you've all got that. Now, I'm hoping today, by running through the history of the project, giving you some background and talking through it, that by the end you'll have a sort of greater appreciation of why certain decisions were made and why we have the infrastructure we have now. Okay. So let's get some context. Let's try and understand where we are. So Glasgow, as a conurbation, has a huge network of roads, many of which were built and developed in the post-war era. You can see there's the main motorway system there and a number of A roads and expressways and dual carriageways, and all these things come together. Now, as part of the Scottish Roads Archive and the Glasgow Motorway Archive before that, we had a keen interest in the development of all of this and still do. But today we are going to focus on the section through the city centre itself, because that's the bit that most people talk about, the section through Charing Cross, across Kingston Bridge and round about Woodside. So the sections in black were what was constructed, but for context I've included the sections that weren't built because it was a proposal for an inner ring road of the city centre. So the sections in blue, they didn't come along. And we'll talk a bit about how that section in black came to be and briefly about why the other section didn't happen as well. Okay, so we'll cover the origins. We're going to talk about comprehensive development because if you really want to understand the road system, areas and things that popped up as part of that. We'll then talk about the planning and design of the system, the construction and the outcome, and then maybe a bit of speculation in the future as well, because there has been a bit of talk about that recently, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware. So it'll be quite interesting just to cover that and perhaps gauge some thoughts at the end. Okay. Right, so why does Glasgow have the road system it has today? Okay, well there's two reasons. The first, that pretty well by this image here that shows pretty squalid housing conditions. That's not nice. That was somewhere in the St George's Cross area, round about the old Dobbie's Loan, round about 1966. Not particularly pleasant. A common problem across Scotland and the UK at that time, you know, a desire to improve things, and at that stage the thinking was very much renewal and replace rather than refurbish and deal with what we have. The second, traffic congestion, because Glasgow, as is now, was always a very busy city and had a lot of traffic. And that image there was taken on Alexandra Parade out at Denniston back in the very early 1970s. And you see a hell of a lot of traffic there, queued up in both directions. That was the main route to Edinburgh from Glasgow until the motorway was finished. So you can imagine that an area like that, where there's a lot of residential properties, a lot of frontage, a lot of shops and facilities, not exactly ideal having the main road to your major cities running through that kind of a urban environment. Okay. So let's consider the origins. Now we mainly as an organisation focus on the sort of post-war period because that's when most of the change came in Glasgow. However, you actually can take it to a period before the war because traffic growth in Glasgow really kicked off in the 20s and rapid growth throughout the decade and into the 30s. And the city started to become constrained even at that point, even when there were horses and carts still on the street, there were issues. And the corporation, Glasgow Corporation, as a result of that, started to consider things that they could do to try and improve the situation within the city itself. And that really led to a number of considerations. There was a proposal for the new tunnel. Now, we have the Clyde Tunnel today, but originally they spoke about building a tunnel perhaps a bit further upstream than that. Didn't really move on much. There was a lot of discussion, not a lot of money available. There was also discussion about the need for a new bridge at Finnieston. That's roughly where the Clyde Arc is today. Again, they couldn't decide on how they would like that to be built, and because of the shipping requirements and the fact that big ships were still coming well into the city at that time, technically it would have been a bit of a challenge. There was a raft of other new roads proposals as well, particularly if you think of some of the areas in the south side of the city, when some of the interwar housing estates were going up and the schemes that were going up, many of them are provided with much wider roads and sort of small urban dual carriageways. So if you think of places like Pollokshaws and some of the areas around about there, you'll see there are dual carriageways within the actual housing schemes themselves. You know, we're trying to future-proof it. The war then came, the Second World War came along. Obviously, everything went on hold, and there was not really any money to push anything forward at that time, the war being the big focus. Things started to change around 1945, when thankfully they knew that the war was starting to come to a close, and they started to look to the future. And at that stage, the corporation city engineer, Robert Bruce, was commissioned to produce a planning report that would detail how the city moved forward in all aspects of its infrastructure. And that looked at housing, it looked at business allocation and space, industrial space, schools and retail, basically everything. But a key component of that was roads, because they knew really that traffic was going to continue to grow. And in fact, Glasgow was one of the few cities in the UK where traffic growth continued through the early part of the 40s. So by the time the war was coming to a close, they knew, hang on, we are going to have to really deal with something here. Now move to this next image, because most people, when you talk about the Bruce report, that is the thing that comes immediately to mind. The report is rather infamously remembered for Bruce's proposals to completely demolish and rebuild the city centre in a modern style. Now, it's quite interesting really to look at, and you can only imagine what Glasgow would have been like if any of it had gone ahead. But within that report, there were actually a number of very sensible proposals for transport, but they're often overlooked and forgotten about. And his was the first report where an inner ring road of the city centre was proposed. Glasgow is a strange conurbation because it's hilly ground to the north, hilly ground to the south. Anything that's looking to go from one end to the other really has to go through the city centre. And even then, all the major trunk roads like the A8, the A74, the A80, the A77, they all converged either in or near the city centre. So you had a hell of a lot of traffic coming through that really had no business in the city centre. And they knew that really we have to try and get that traffic away, because you don't want traffic heading for Greenock from Edinburgh, heading up St Vincent Street or around the north of the city centre. It really wasn't a good idea, and they didn't want that to continue. He also had proposals for other outer ring roads. At its time, you know, what we would know today as park and ride facilities, he advocated that kind of idea long before it was ever being considered elsewhere. And if you ever have a chance to look at the Bruce plan in the Mitchell Library, be sure to look at the folios, the fold-out folio drawings at the back, because there are some pretty stunning examples of how he envisaged transport hubs and things coming together. Things that are very much policy today, he was thinking about, 80 years ago. Now, things didn't really change much through the 40s. The corporation made the decision to prioritise the tunnel, which they'd been discussing before the war. So the Clyde Tunnel was prioritised for construction due to the limited funds available. It was given approval in 1948, although construction didn't actually start until 1957. But that was really the only major project within the city that was moved on or made any progress during the decade itself. But to understand the remaining parts of the road network, thinking of that ring road of the city centre, and some of the other roads that are built like the M8, the M74, the M77, you really need to start to think about comprehensive development and what that meant as a concept. Now, the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act of 1947 was brought in basically as a way to allow cities and towns across the UK that had been badly affected by bomb damage during the war, or had particular problems with deprivation or high urban densities that were looking to make changes, to designate entire areas within a city or a town or a village as comprehensive development areas. Now, in essence, what that meant was anything within the boundary of that area would be completely demolished and they would start again. That's really what comprehensive development is. You're starting from scratch. And there was a drive for this across the UK. There are some good examples, not just in Glasgow, but even places like Motherwell and Greenock, who also used comprehensive development as a way of moving things forward. Now, in Glasgow, the corporation were all for it because Glasgow was described as the sick man of the UK. It obviously had a whole raft of problems, social problems, which we're probably mostly aware of and won't really talk about here. But they ended up designating 29 of these areas from one end of the city to the other. Some famous ones include Gorbals, Townhead, Woodside. I'll show you some examples of a couple in a minute. And these were all ironed out and designated by the mid-1950s. Now, what the roads planners realised at that point was, if you're starting from scratch and you've got nice empty pockets of land and you want to provide a new and modern road system, this is the best way to do it. Because you're not displacing people for the construction of new roads. Now, that's not to say there aren't places in the city where that did happen, and I will cover that. But on the whole, where the new urban motorway was envisaged to be was entirely within an area designated for comprehensive redevelopment. So it was an empty piece of land, and it therefore made it far easier to squeeze the piece of road through. It was actually a surprise to me, and other people often ask. People assume that most of the areas were cleared for the road itself. It's not actually the case. The road was basically, it took advantage of the fact that there was going to be a nice empty piece of land at various parts of the city. Now, if we move on to the next one, we'll show you some here. So this is the 1955 proposals. Now, I've picked Townhead and Anderson Cross because they're probably the most famous with regards to the M8 coming through the city itself. So the one at Townhead, so the red line marking the boundary, absolutely huge boundary, a massive area, and almost everything within that boundary was completely cleared and rebuilt. Now, the motorway is a very small slither of land coming through the sort of middle of that. In fact, if I've got the laser here, which I know people on the other side may not see, but up in this corner here where the canal had used to be, the motorway was squeezed through that area there. And likewise at Anderson Cross, where the Kingston Bridge is, and that whole complex round about there, thinking about where the Hilton Hotel is and all of that, that was all within that boundary as well. But if you look to the west, so if you're looking to the western side of that boundary, everything along the older Gyle Street, that was all demolished as a result of comprehensive development. Nothing to do with the roads proposals at all, rather interestingly. And that image in the top right of that slide, that shows the proposal for the inner ring road as it had developed in that 10-year period. So after Bruce's plan came in, he said, well, actually, that's not a bad idea. Let's start to think about how that might look. What sort of a form could that take? And it was at that stage they started to think, well, maybe we should restrict it to certain types of traffic. We should keep pedestrians away because we want to get this traffic moved quickly away from the city centre as quickly as possible. We don't want pedestrians and cyclists and things getting on there. The way to do that is to classify it as a motorway. It was very early to be talking about that sort of thing, and indeed at that point there were no urban motorways in Britain. But again, due to the issues with finance and their need to iron out the exact details of these comprehensive development areas, not much really changed. It was only in 1960, with the finalisation of the quinquennial development plan, that they were able to move forward. And crucially at that point, much more money was being made available to Glasgow and across Scotland by central government. The Scottish Office had a lot of money to hand out, and they were actively encouraging the redevelopment of city centres, towns, villages all across the country. And that kicked off that period of intense redevelopment of Scotland, of which today we're still using. The road system, the schools, think of all those 1960s comprehensive schools, loads of other facilities, the sort of post-war housing estates, Easterhouse, Castle, places like that, they all came about as a result of this change in policy and the money being available. Now back to the roads. So specific to the roads policy itself, in 1960 a number of people were appointed that were key to the development of the road system we have today and basically would shape Glasgow for a period of 20 to 25 years thereafter. The biggest of the three was Scott Wilson Kirkpatrick and Partners, an engineering consultancy based in England. They had some capability when it came to the design of urban roads. They were appointed in February of 1960. Now at that point they sought out engineers who had experience of design of urban roads, urban motorways. In the UK at that time there were very few. But by chance, a man called John Cullen, who was born and brought up in St George's Cross, and who had studied at night school at this very university, became involved because of his involvement in America. After he graduated, he saw an opportunity to go and use his highway skills in the United States and in Canada. And he worked on a number of freeway proposals in San Francisco, Las Vegas, and in Ottawa, because they were 20 years ahead of us when it came to the design of these brand new major urban roads. He had made a decision to come back to Scotland to work in the Cumbernauld New Town, because they were also developing a new road system, a modern road system. So he got wind of the fact that Glasgow was looking to redevelop its road system and immediately applied and was given a position. And he, along with a chap called Roy Hodgin, set about setting up traffic studies and making predictions of what was required. Now, that initial study that they were given was to carry out traffic studies and make recommendations on what type of road it should be. Because although they thought they wanted an urban motorway, they really weren't quite sure whether that was justified. So they would set about doing these traffic studies to try and predict 30 to 40 years in the future about the levels of traffic that Glasgow as a city and a conurbation would be seeing. Now, on the back of that, it was decided that yes, an urban motorway was the most effective way of getting traffic across the conurbation and around the city centre unhindered, because it was a key sort of a point of the commission with Glasgow Corporation that they wanted quick and easy access to the central area while also being able to bypass it. So it was combining the role of bypass and distributor road. Now, Scott Wilson immediately impressed the corporation. There weren't a lot of staff in Scotland, or never mind the UK, who could really become involved in this. And the corporation were really quite pleased with Scott Wilson when they offered to pay 50% of the cost of teaching people the necessary skills to become involved. So they sent people to Strathclyde University, Glasgow University on civil engineering, highway courses. Scott Wilson met half the cost of that for the corporation. And those staff worked for the corporation, didn't work for Scott Wilson. The corporation needed to be able to oversee these projects. Scott Wilson said, well, we help. Don't imagine that would happen too much today, but it just goes to show that there was a very good working relationship between them and their consultant. And so impressed with the corporation that the scope of the work they were doing grew and grew and grew. Eventually, they became involved in the design of the highway system for the entire city. That became the highway plan for Glasgow, which we've spoken about on other talks, if anybody's seen them. There's a bit of information on that on our website, I'll mention at the end. They also then became involved in a number of the traffic studies and designs for road systems in some of the towns round about, Rutherglen, Motherwell, Kirkintilloch, places like that. And eventually they were given the commission by the Scottish Office to design the road system for the entire conurbation. And that became known as the Greater Glasgow Transportation Study. It also considered public transport as well as part of its proposals and remains the largest single transport study ever undertaken in Scotland, looking at all modes of transport. Now, some of those other people that were involved, W.A. Fairhurst and Partners, a Glasgow-based consultant engineer, well known at that point. W.A. Fairhurst himself was very well known for his design of bridges. Other bridges, he designed Tay Bridge. It's a good example of one. He was involved in the design of the concrete supports for Erskine Bridge a bit later than this. But they were quite lucky and they got commissioned to design the Kingston Bridge, or what was known as the Finiston Bridge at that point. Always was going to be a high-level bridge across the Clyde because, as I mentioned a bit earlier, navigation of shipping was still was quite important at that time, and the Clyde Navigation Trust were insistent that be able to continue as far upstream as Custom House Quay. As is often the case in Scottish road building, by the time the bridge was finished, that wasn't happening. And actually, it led to a number of revisions, elsewhere. But one of the proposals that Fairhurst had come up with originally, actually, was to provide a low-level and an upper-level bridge. So local traffic would be able to cross the river below and motorway traffic up top. But the Navigation Trust, very powerful organisation at that time, stuck the heels in, said no. So that was killed off. And eventually, we got the Clyde Arc 40 years later, because that need for that movement of traffic was still there. Eventually, their commission was expanded to include the west flank of the Inner Ring Road as well. That's the section through Charing Cross. Probably the most controversial. We'll cover that just a bit later. And then the bottom one. This is a very interesting one. Hallford and Associates. So Sir William Hallford. Has anybody heard of Sir William Hallford? Some people have, some not. Right, okay. He was a renowned architect. More known for a lot of his work down south, in London in particular. Glasgow Corporation were very lucky to get him. And they brought him on board basically to advise on any of the engineering proposals that were being made. So the corporation appointed a consulting architect on all highway schemes. That doesn't happen. It didn't happen. It certainly didn't happen in places like Manchester, Birmingham or London, where whatever the engineer proposed tended to get built. In Glasgow, there was this real desire to try and make these new roads fit within the urban fabric as well as they could have. And as a result of that, his firm of associates had final approval of all designs that were coming through. Now that's led to a number of interesting features, which again we'll highlight just a bit later. But a very interesting fact that, the corporation even from day one was very keen to ensure that this mega new road, the likes of which the city had never seen before, was able to fit in. And there's things that you probably never noticed that I'll outline. And you'll think, all right, it's a direct outcome of those guys. And they ended up having a relationship with Glasgow Corporation, Strathclyde Regional Council and the Scottish Office for 30 to 35 years until the company sadly was acquired by someone else. Now, just continuing on the theme of the planning, if I can get my slide to move on, there we go. So Scott Wilson worked through the proposals for an inner ring road through 1960, 1961. Traffic studies and surveys were carried out all over the city. That included stopping cars, asking them simple questions. Where have you come from? Where are you going? How often do you do it? And they used all that, no computers, brought all that data together and made a prediction for 1990 on what levels of traffic we would see on Glasgow's roads. Now, believe it or not, at 1990, they were within 2 or 3 percentage points of accuracy. They were bang on accurate. A testament to the skill of the people involved, because I say there was no computers to analyse that data. It was very much a team of people focused solely on that and bringing their expertise from elsewhere. But absolutely fantastic to imagine, that being the case. The line of the ring road was never really in any doubt, because topographically around Glasgow, if you're familiar with the Garnet Hill area, Charing Cross, you've got steep rising ground to both sides. You were never really going to put the road at the top of a hill. It was always going to squeeze through that tight canyon. So on the upper right there, you can see they did consider some alternative lines for the ring road, but mostly down the east and southern sections of it. The section through Charing Cross and Anderston was more or less always going to be where it is. There's one there on the sort of top right image of that slide. You can see where they're probably going a bit further into Park Circus. But the corporation obviously weren't keen on that because it wasn't designated for redevelopment. And the image on the bottom right there I've just included to try and give you some idea of how the ring would look around the city. So you can see Central Station there, the old Enoch Station, Kingston Power Station, some other things that probably just help you sort of get your bearings. So pretty tight, pretty close to the central area. Okay. Now in those days, we didn't have computer generated images to put out to show people what these new roads would look like. Obviously people were completely unaware. This was a foreign concept, across most of the UK, never mind Glasgow. So they produced these famous visualizations by artist Alexander Duncan Bell, a wonderful illustrator who became involved in roads for much of his career. That sums it up pretty well. I mean, that could be taken on the Kingston Bridge today looking north. It really could be. That's how accurate it was. And believe it or not, those high rises on the right, that was part of the original plan for the Anderson Centre, which was scaled back again and again and again as it evolved and developed through the 60s and 70s. But that was the original proposal. And you can see roughly where the Hilton Hotel is as well. So, it's all very in line with what was envisaged. Coming a bit further north into Charing Cross, you can see the Mitchell Library there. All right, there's a bit of change there. The proposal for the buildings and the complex there that you see over Sauchiehall Street, that obviously didn't go ahead in its original form, but some of the other things did. And it's, you know immediately where it's supposed to be. It's not too dissimilar. They also built a number of models and put them on show at public exhibitions that were very well attended. So you see on the left-hand side, one through Charing Cross, again with that original proposal for the bridge over. Just to make the point on that, you'll see the bridge that goes over Tea House, as it is now next to the Mitchell Library. You often see people describe it as a road or a bridge to nowhere. It was never intended to take a road. It was always going to take an office block. It's just that the plan for the development fell through not long after the road was built. And that's why it lay empty for 20 odd years before Tea House was eventually built in the late 80s and early 90s. So that one was never going to take a road. And Townhead and the Kingston Bridge obviously there as well. Now construction. Okay, a broad overview of the construction. So this is the section that was built from Townhead round to Tradeston. That spanned the period December 1965 to February 1972. At the time, it cost £25 million. Now, that's only about £350 million today. Not a lot of money. I don't imagine it would cost that today if you were building it. So many things have changed regards environmental requirements and studies and whatnot. 25% of that cost was met by the corporation itself. So they put up a considerable amount of money, as most local authorities in Scotland were able to do at that time. The Scottish Office provided 75% grant assistance. What that meant was that the motorway was actually owned and maintained by the corporation. They did all the cleaning and all the repairs and all that, and that continued up until 1996, until the regions were abolished. It was very much Glasgow's motorway, only taken on by the government much, much later. And it was indeed the largest civil engineering project of the 20th century in Glasgow. There were other transport projects and things that happened, but the construction of the motorways by far was the biggest, Kingston Bridge in particular. In those comprehensive development areas that I mentioned, demolition continued in many areas after 1972. The public's view of them changed and soured very quickly when people started to realise what it meant, particularly in places like Townhead and Gorbals, where entire communities were moved and demolished for new housing, not just for the road. As people started to realise that, other areas started to kick back. So places like Partick, Glasgow Cross, parts of St George's Cross, they were all scaled back and eventually cancelled once the corporation ceased to exist in 1975. Now, we'll just talk through the various contracts. We're going to start at Townhead and we'll do a bit of a tour all the way around. And I've got some nice, and some interesting images here to show, if I can get the slide to move. There we go. So that's an aerial, that was going to happen, back one. That's an aerial image looking east above Townhead and Royston. Okay, you can see the construction of the two M8 ramps right in the middle of the image and the Baird Street Bridge to the south of that. Okay, you can see the old Alexandra Parade on the right-hand side as well, that long straight line of tenements. That was completely demolished to allow for the expansion of the Royal Infirmary. So you can see the road coming through there. This image was taken in 1966. Townhead Interchange obviously grew and became much bigger over that. It was built between November 65 and March 1968, becoming the first contract of the Inner Ring Road project to open, and indeed the first section of Glasgow, first section of motorway, within the Glasgow city boundary. Take us down to ground level, that's a good one. So that's the old Parliamentary Road coming up towards Royston from the city centre. That's Castle Street going down to the left, and you see the two M8 flyovers, ramps J and K as they're known, being constructed in the middle of the screen there. You would not be able to put up that a comparison with that image today because so much has changed, you just simply wouldn't recognise it. But it's certainly very interesting. So all of that property there that you can see west of the motorway, all of it flattened through the 60s and 70s as part of comprehensive development. And people obviously moved. Some stayed in the Townhead area, others obviously moved further afield. Now continuing west along the motorway, we get to Woodside. And that's the section around the north of the city centre. Originally, the proposal was that they were going to run the road a bit further to the south, but John Cullen and the team realised that by pushing the road further north and sort of making use of the industrial sites that were located next to the old canal and indeed part of the old canal itself, they could minimise the amount of demolition and severance that was there, or would be there, because Cowcaddens as a development area was always going to come along, so it did make sense to push the motorway north of that. That section was elevated so that the existing surface street network could be maintained. Garscube Road, New City Road, Phoenix Road, all those all still exist in some form. However, there was a lot of demolition and the character of that area was changed quite considerably as part of the comprehensive development programme. Stunning image in the bottom right there of the viaduct under construction from above. Balfour Beatty, big contractor involved in that, and Scott Wilson, Kirkpatrick, who were involved in the traffic studies and devising the ring road, they were actually given the design of that part of the civil engineering work as well. That was a very innovative way of doing it. It was very quick. The beams for the bridge were actually constructed on site, so they didn't have to transport them across Scotland. That saved a lot of money and meant that within 2 years that entire project was completed. Again, only a cost of around £3 million. Moving further west, this is the image that the guys have been using as part of the City in Flux team this year at Charing Cross. Now, Charing Cross is the one that stands out the most because it wasn't a comprehensive development area. Charing Cross was never going to be wholesale cleared and rebuilt. However, it was, from an engineering point of view, the best place for the new road to go. So what they did was they came up with a proposal to try and mitigate against the effect of the motorway coming through that area. Originally the proposal, the engineering proposal, was to run it through there on stilts, kind of similar to what was done at Woodside. However, Hallford's company really said, no way, you can't do that, this is Charing Cross. It's a historic area, going to continue to be a desirable place to be. We need to try and minimise the impact of the road. And it's for that reason that the road was placed in cutting through that location. At considerable additional expense, I might add, it was something like 25 to 30% more expensive to go down than it was to go up, because they had to move services and utilities and all that came with it. But the corporation agreed that that was the way to do it. And looking at that image there, you can see Charing Cross Mansions. It is obviously a stark image to look at, but they did a number of things to try and minimise the impact. And I suppose if you stand in Sauchiehall Street, west of the motorway, and you look due east towards the city centre, you actually don't know there is a motorway there. You'll hear it, obviously, but you can't see it. Visually, it's not there. So that's something that they did. And the tea house development that we spoke about, the whole purpose of having that development on a bridge over the motorway was to try and close that area in. Because if you do stand there at Bath Street and you look down, you can see right out to the south of Glasgow. They didn't want to open Charing Cross up like that. They wanted to try and keep it closed in. So that was the reason for trying to maintain that continuity down Sauchiehall Street. Unfortunately, the concept didn't quite come to pass as early as they would have hoped. We have another one here looking the other way from St George's Mansions. Again, if I can just get it to change. There we go. That one also looks particularly dark. That's looking back towards Woodside. Garnet Hill area up there on the right. Again, parts of Garnet Hill were designated comprehensive development, so that kind of boundary between Charing Cross, Garnet Hill, there was a lot of clearance of tenements and whatnot. How many people here are aware of the Garnet Hill viewpoint? All right, a good few. That came about as part of the motorway design. John Cullen, who grew up in that area, used to love going up high in the tenements and looking out to the north and seeing the hills. He was a keen hill walker and climber. And obviously, where they were carving out tenements and there was going to be this stepped arrangement of the slope, he said, well, okay, we can't build anything here. Why don't we put a viewpoint in? And originally, before the vegetation came up, you could see for miles all around the west of Glasgow. And I believe there is still a plaque up there, actually, that points out some of the major features on the horizon. Moving a bit further down again, so in front of the Mitchell, thinking of that image from earlier that we were looking at, not too dissimilar. The Charing Cross tower development on the right-hand side there now, the Premier Inn. You can see there the road being constructed in cutting. We'll talk a bit about the future of this section and the cap and whatnot that's proposed for there. But that whole area was sort of constrained, so they decided to go down, but they could only go down so far because the North Clyde line goes through that area in a tunnel immediately next to the Mitchell Library. And if you're ever driving the M8 there, you'll see this very subtle hump as you drive through, and that constrains headroom. That is minimum point, I think you're only something like 3 metres is the maximum height of the wall. That's making it difficult for them to cap more of that. It's not exactly easy to move or resite a railway tunnel, particularly a live one. And that was a constraint they had at that point as well. And that was designed by Fairhurst. Watling's construction involved in that one, a well-known contractor in Scotland at that point, built many of the motorway schemes across the country. Finally, Kingston Bridge, stunning bridge. Okay, I know a lot of people don't like it, but from an civil engineering point of view, it is rather impressive. It was listed back in 2020 as part of the anniversary, a move we did support, I might add, simply because it is so unique. You can see the way it had to be built because the Clyde Navigation Trust insisted that shipping be able to continue upstream even during the construction. They had to build it using a cantilever method where they worked out from both sides of the river and met in the middle. An interesting fact about Kingston Bridge, it's not one bridge, it's actually 6. It's 6 separate hollow boxes sitting side by side, held together by tendons. So a lot of people don't know that's actually hollow inside. When we go into Kingston Bridge, you can walk from one end to the other internally, huge big hollow box. So that's something, we should try and get that on the Doors Open Days programme. Yeah, leave it with me. Just a couple other images there as well, looking out. So, fascinating. Now that was Duncan Logan were involved in that. So, again, a great Scottish contractor, but the project actually killed them off. They went bust as a result of that, and they built so many good projects across Scotland at that time. Not just roads, but vast array of water, sewer, projects, all that sort of stuff. Across the bridge in the bottom right. And just a final image there. Obviously, when parts of the ring road were done, they did it in a way that if money stopped becoming available, or if it was decided to change or not proceed, that what was built would tie in nicely with what was there already. So you can see this great arrangement at the south side of the bridge. There's no motorway continuing towards Hillington at that point. It didn't come for another 7 years, or 6 years. So they had this sort of gyratory setup where you could still make all the necessary movements. You can see there's still some tenements at that point in the Tradeston area at Kinning Park. That was all cleared as part of comprehensive development. In fact, that was one, I think that was the only one where it was completely rezoned. So it was changed from residential to business. So you think of all those sort of industrial units that are in that area now, that all came about as part of that sort of industrial development. Okay, so what was the outcome? From a traffic engineering point of view, the outcome was that road safety was vastly improved. There was a huge reduction in accidents and injuries. Now, I showed you earlier how busy Alexandra Parade had been. Lots of kids were getting knocked down and killed in Glasgow's roads at that time. The construction of this new road system, keeping traffic separate, from pedestrians and cyclists, had a huge effect. In fact, a study done in 2015 by John Cullen, who was still active at that point and engaged in these things, he found through research that around 10,000 serious injury accidents and almost 1,000 fatalities had been saved as a result of the construction of the M8 from Baillieston all the way through to Hillington. So that's a huge number. From an engineering point of view, that's what they were setting out to do. That's one of the reasons that they were trying to get traffic off the main roads, was to try and reduce these accidents, free up space for other people. And the ease of movement for people, goods, and reduced journey times was obviously a major part of it. In 1965, it was easily taking an hour or to an hour and a half to get from Townhead to Charing Cross through the city centre. It was particularly busy at peak times. When the motorway opened, it changed to 2 minutes. So that was obviously, a huge benefit to people, particularly people who weren't looking to be in the city centre. That was of benefit to them. But also people who were looking to move from parts of Glasgow to other parts. So even today, there's a lot of people make journeys from like Maryhill to Baillieston, and they come down and they'll use the motorway or parts of the ring road. The people that go from Townhead to Charing Cross, they use the motorway because the ring road was designed to do that. It was channel traffic around the city without it coming in. And Glasgow today remains one of the least congested city centres in Britain. And that's why we're able to do things like the Avenues projects and things like that with little disruption to traffic. Because out with the peak periods in the morning and the afternoon, if you stand, I did this a few weeks ago just to get some photos actually. If you stand on like Cathedral Street or St Vincent Street at like 11 o'clock in the morning, you might see a couple of light goods vehicles, 1 or 2 cars, some buses. That's really about it. It doesn't tend to get much busier than that. That in itself is quite a feat when you think, say, of what Edinburgh is like at the same time. It can be busy particularly badly throughout the day. We did end up with a road with very interesting and some unique features, which I'll show you some of them in a minute. And obviously the renewed urban environment, which was the original thing they set out to achieve. Pedestrianised shopping areas, that was a key part of the corporation's commission. So we pedestrianised Sauchiehall Street, then Buchanan Street, then Argyll Street very quickly after the completion of the ring road because traffic obviously was non-existent. Sauchiehall Street prior to the motorway was one of the busiest roads in central Glasgow. So was Buchanan Street to an extent actually. Bus priority and parking was another big thing. We were talking about bus lanes in 1965, well before many other UK cities. It did take a bit longer for them to come through, but the proposals were there. And likewise, parking controls. 1965 saw the introduction of on-street parking controls in Glasgow. They restricted it to something like 8,000 parking spaces across the city. Prior to that, it was a free-for-all. You could park where you liked, whenever you wanted, really without specific restrictions. And there were also a number of car parks proposed and built around the circumference of the inner ring road as well. So in that slide there, you can see in the bottom right, that's Cambridge Street multi-storey under construction. If you think about where all of Glasgow City Council's car parks are multi-stories, Charing Cross, Concert Square, Cadogan Street, they're all around the edge of the ring road because what they wanted was people come off the motorway system, dump the car at the edge, make the rest of the journey on foot, walk into the city centre or take a bus. They didn't want the cars coming in. That was just like today, there was a desire to keep traffic away. You see Buchanan Street, that's 1975, so you can see there it still looks like an old road, but it's been closed off. Nice flower beds, benches, places to sit. Looks like a nice environment. We could almost look back and take some inspiration from ourselves as to how to do things now, And the parking meters there on Queen Street, looking south towards the old Debenhams building at Scenic Centre and the one on the top right. Some of those interesting features, most of which come through as a result of Hallford's proposals. That is a retaining wall. If you look at retaining walls on motorways in Manchester or places like that, you'll just look at grey concrete. In Glasgow, we get a nice aggregate finished wall panel sitting in the top. That's a Perthshire blue flint. Now, you won't see that now because they're very dirty, but whenever you're driving along anywhere in Glasgow in the motorway system, you will see those wall panels. Some of them are at the end of their life now and are about to be upgraded and changed, but they did well, and as I say, produced and provided and added at significant extra cost. Look at the curbs as well. High quality edging along the bottom there of the image, an American idea that was brought to Glasgow. They're all still in position, solid, you know, bomb-proof, very much still on the go. And the hard standing areas as well, you know, you see the slabbed areas in front of the walls rather than weeds and vegetation. It's not to say there aren't weeds and some vegetation there now, but the proposal always was that it be kept well maintained, so that wasn't an issue. The most famous element, the Glasgow overhead sign gantry. You won't see that anywhere else in the world. Nowhere else in the UK. That was a Glasgow design thing. That was all part of the proposal to minimise the impact of the motorway on the urban environment. If you look at sign gantries elsewhere, they can be 15, 20 metres high. That is a simple box, illuminated internally on a single row. Still in use today. We now have over 150 of them across the network. They were added again and again as more was built. And all, crucially, painted white. Glasgow had a colour scheme. Lights, gantries, and vehicle parapet rails were all white. Pedestrian parapets and stairwell railings and things like that were all black. You still see some sites of that if you look closely. A lot of it's chipped and faded away now, particularly off the motorways. But if you look, you'll see that. And of course, hard shoulders were red, as was the case across the whole country at that point. And they utilised high mast lighting to save on low-level lighting columns, and it was able to floodlight greater areas. This one at Woodside, another one of the gantries. Another feature we have at Charing Cross is traffic joining the motorway on the wrong side, the right-hand side. No, it wasn't an accident. No, they were never going to reverse the way traffic was using the motorway system, as Radio Clyde asked us once as part of an interview. No, we weren't switching to driving on the right-hand side. It was done to reduce the amount of land that was required to build the motorway and traffic weaving. There was a motorway planned that was going to head out to the north of the city, the Maryhill Motorway, and those slips meant that traffic coming on there could very quickly leave on that motorway, so they weren't crossing, because when you start doing this with traffic, you get congestion. And that's what you want to avoid as a traffic engineer. So that was another interesting feature. There are still two at Town Head. They're kind of accidental. That was intended to be a motorway to motorway connection, so they wouldn't have been exits as such, but we've been left with a permanent feature. And of course, there's the famous ski ramps run at the Kingston Bridge end as well. Another one here showing the finish. Masonry clad retaining walls at Town Head to match in with the character of the area. You can see all the new high-rises popping up at that point as well, mostly all now gone. And the Pinkston Power Station cooling tower, the largest in Europe at the time, and demolished this week in 1976, apparently, when I was looking back on my notes. So I think it was the 19th of September it was demolished. That's an interesting one. And Charing Cross, the one that's most controversial, but always good to see an image of what it looked like when it was finished in its prime. You can see the white and black railing standing out there against the lights. A lot of vegetation, more trees planted for the motorway projects in Glasgow than for any other single project in the history of the city. Something like 300,000 trees, mostly all still there now. If you go out further in the motorway out towards Easterhouse, out towards Hillington, and you go off the motorway, you can't see the motorway because the vegetation's so established now. And even round about there it is as well. I mean, much of this has been redeveloped. Okay, so what does the future hold? Well, we know there's proposals for Charing Cross. I can get my slide to move on. There we go. Proposals for Charing Cross. Obviously the most controversial. It was then. There was a protest, a small protest, but there were still people there at the opening day who weren't happy about it. That's never really gone away. So Glasgow City Council now looking at proposals to try and improve the environment around there with a cap. Interesting, probably really enhance that area around there. I don't think it's a bad thing. It'd be good to see. As I mentioned earlier, the railway tunnel kind of constrains how far along they can go. But it'll be interesting to see if that happens. Hopefully they'll get funding for that. Some of you will be aware that there is a campaign to replace the M8 through Glasgow as well. So it'll be demolition or repurposing. An emerging theme at the minute is embodied carbon. Now I mentioned that the project was the largest civil engineering project in the city of the 20th century. The embodied carbon in that motorway will be huge. It'll be off the scale. So rather than ripping it all out, should we be looking at repurposing, reusing? It's one of the busiest motorways in Europe, not just the UK, not just Scotland. It's a strategic route. If you take that away and you've got 200,000 vehicles a day on it, where do they go? Now, people say use the M74. The M74 was designed for 150,000 vehicles a day, and it's already at that. So that 200,000 vehicles needs to go somewhere. So we really need to start thinking about, well, if we're going to do that, we need to improve other aspects of transport, encourage people into public transport, trains, buses, because at the moment, people are using cars because it's the most convenient. You know, there's no viable alternatives for most people, and it's the cheapest. So if you're going to make that level of change, we're really going to have to think about it, because you can't just close a road overnight and say 200,000 vehicles can just go elsewhere. Not going to work. And there are, obviously, a lot of people do say as well, but other cities have removed and closed urban highways and things. That's true, they have. And in places like Amsterdam and in Canada and places, they have removed sections of motorway. But none of them have ever been a strategic motorway. That's where the challenge comes in. You know, it would be like going to Birmingham and saying we're going to close the M6. You know, that's the M8 to Glasgow. It's the conurbation. It's people getting from the west to the east. You know, and yeah, in the highway plan for Glasgow, there were plans for intermediate ring roads and outer ring roads, and had they all been built and we had the complete system, it'd probably actually quite easy to do it, because Charing Cross was meant to be the quietest section of motorway in the conurbation. But because we didn't build the rest, we've ended up with the situation we're in. So, you know, all these decisions all come together and create a problem. And I've added in there about managed motorways and bus priority, because I know that's been looked at. They've just added a bus lane actually in the M8 between junction 1 and 2, sort of mimicking what they had already done in the M90 up across the Queensferry crossing up into Fife. So there might be some more of that coming. So the interurban bus services, you know, coming in from Edinburgh, from Lanarkshire, from Renfrewshire, trying to get to the city centre, rather than sitting in the queues in the morning, they'll be able to jump in the hard shoulder, come through and into Buchanan bus station or whatever without any delays. Maybe that will encourage more people into buses. Who knows? We'll see. Before I take some questions, just to mention the Scottish Roads Archive, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, we are a volunteer organisation. This is a hobby. We're not funded by government or anything like that. We do it ourselves. If you want to support us, if you've got any material you'd like to donate to us from anywhere across Scotland or the UK, please look up our website, scottishroadsarchive.org. You'll find contact information on there. We do have a range of booklets, the one in the Kingston Bridge for the 50th anniversary, Erskine Bridge anniversary as well, and one recently for Keswick up in Inverness. We sell these booklets at a low cost to try and bring in some funds to keep us going, because I say we are entirely self-funded. So if you want to support us, find us on there, give us a shout. And we are on social media as well. Okay. And I think I've been talking enough. So we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Stuart. We are keen to take some questions. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Yeah, I'll bring you the microphone.
Hi, Stuart. You briefly mentioned the Maryhill Motorway. I know it's probably, you know, the answer is going to be no, but obviously we feel the effects of that not being built in this part of the city quite acutely to this day on Great Western Road and Balmoor Road, Maryhill. Are you aware of any proposals to do anything to mitigate the northwest of this part of the city? No?
Nope.
No.
Not a thing.
It's not happening.
Not a thing. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been an official proposal since 1994 when the bus lanes went in under Strathclyde region. I don't think it's been looked at since. Everything that was predicted in the plan of 65 came to pass. And it's kind of funny because the reasons that people argued against the motorway, they've kind of ended up with far worse by not having it down the line. That's hindsight, of course, it's easy to say. But yeah, sadly not. Anyone else?
Hi, Stuart. It was a great talk. I was just wondering, see the models you showed?
Yes.
Do they still exist?
Yes, some of them do. You know the Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre on the south side at Nits Hill? I believe they're in there. The last time I asked, they couldn't tell me where they were, but they are. We know they're in there. There's also a large one apparently in the SEC in the loft, and above one of the big halls. Randomly, somebody got in touch to say, "Did you know that's in there?" No, we didn't, but we do now. So there, yeah. So apparently they are. There are new models that have been built of Kingston and Erskine that Transport Scotland commissioned as part of the anniversaries. COVID has resulted in them being unveiled. That's been delayed, but we're hoping to get them into the Riverside Museum. So keep an eye on our social media feeds. Hoping to do that in the next few months or weeks. One at the back.
Hi. Why did the other half of the ring road not get built?
Politics. There's three reasons. The corporation it was their project, they were huge advocates for it. When they ceased to exist in 1975, Strathclyde Regional Council and the District Council came in. That brought in a lot of new councillors, younger councillors, who had a slightly different view on it. There were some local protests as well, people who were rightly concerned about the effect on the area, also the comprehensive development part, all kind of fitted together, and money, to be honest, because Strathclyde did retain a project, the Townhead to London Road link, which was going to be mostly underground and built on the Collegelands site, but they never had the money to build it. So it all kind of went away. That's the main reasons. If I was to pick a single reason, I would say local government reorganisation is the biggest single reason. The corporation had made it plain that they were more than happy to plough on even where people weren't happy.
Hi Stuart, great talk. You touched on the Charing Cross junction and traffic coming on and off in the outside lane.
Yep.
I was a student here in the early 80s, and one of my pals warned her dad when he was driving up from Liverpool that he'd be coming off from the outside lane. He point blank refused to believe her and just kept driving.
Missed this junction.
Took him quite some time to find the place. So part of my question is, how unique was that in the UK then, and how unique is it now? And the other part of my question is, can you touch on what's gone wrong? Why is the Kingston Bridge now much less you're much less able to move across it than you were, because they've had to cone it off and reduce the traffic, and it's the same at that junction now around Charing Cross as well, presumably for at least a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. On the first point, on the right hand exits, it was very unique then. There is one similar example in Leeds, but it's a very short stretch and it's not coming on from a main road. So Charing Cross is really the only ones that's joining at a major intersection. It's now, I think the one in Leeds may actually be gone now. So I think Charing Cross is the only one left, so it's very unique. And of course the ones at Townhead that were accidental. But yeah, because it was an urban motorway and it had different requirements, different standards, the 50 mile an hour speed limit and the like, it was felt that it was safer to move across. And I think it was 1971, the Scottish Office did mandate that no further offside slip roads would be constructed at that point. But the accident rate on them is no different to any other slip roads in Glasgow. Second point in Kingston Bridge, we often get asked that question about why there's permanent barrier on the west, it's a northbound carriageway. The main reason for that is when they were doing all the refurbishment works back in the 1990s, they coned that off because they had a lot of ballast on the bridge to hold it in place while they were propping it and moving it. And what they discovered was that it had a really positive impact on traffic. Remember earlier when I was saying about all this, you get people coming on from West Street moving into the motorway, people from the motorway trying to get to the SEC and the Clydeside Expressway. That conflict was causing traffic problems and accidents, and they found that by coning the situation improved. Now, we've lost a lot of the benefit because traffic has increased considerably beyond what it was even at that stage. So it's maybe not just so easy to see that because there is still congestion on the bridge, but it did make a big impact, I believe, at the time on the safety part of it. Guards Woodside, that's refurbishment. That will all come off at some point in the near future. Lots of information online, Transport Scotland's website. Any more? One more? Yep.
Hi. I totally take your point about the whole point of the motorway being built to take the congestion out of areas like Alexandra Parade. I'm a cyclist and I'm 44 years old. I've never owned a car in Glasgow. I've worked all around Glasgow. I've never needed a car. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting to look at the impact on obesity and on the environment of the M8 motorway, because you talk about, you know, the reduction of travel time, but all I see is, I mean, I think there's other things to take into consideration as well as just making life easier for the car owners.
Now, I should point out, it wasn't about making life easier for car owners at that time in Glasgow. It was about the movement of goods primarily. But you're right, car ownership has skyrocketed because it's the most viable way of travel for most people, particularly given the nature of our conurbation, where you've got lots of people who work in Lanarkshire, who stay in Renfrewshire, and vice versa. In terms of the environment, and health, right? Obesity, that's not my bag. Can't tell you about that at all. I'm sure there are studies probably done here actually about what effect access to private vehicles has had on obesity levels and the like. Whole other debate I ain't touching. But in terms of the environmental aspect, what I can say is if you've ever looked at the air quality maps of Glasgow, you know the one where you've got the bright reds where there's a lot of emissions. If you look at the motorway strip coming through, right, it's always amber. The red is always contained around about the main bus routes on Hope Street. you know, the one coming up beside the central station up the hill where you've got all the buses coming through. If you look at the motorway, because it's free flow for 3/4 of the day, actually the effect of it is less than it is. If you've got static traffic sitting, the emissions are obviously going to be far worse, the particulate matter, all these sorts of things that affect. But when you've got free flow traffic, the effect on the immediate environment is not so bad. Where there has been a particularly negative effect on the environment is noise. And the noise from traffic, particularly in channels, wasn't really understood at that time. In fact, one of the first studies done by the Transport Research Laboratory in the UK, looking at noise and the impact of it from road construction, was done at Charing Cross. We've got a number of papers that actually talk about that and how noise does this as it moves away from the road. So like the people up at Garnet Hill and at Park Circus, they actually hear more of it than the people immediately adjacent to it, just because of the nature of the way it spreads. And that led to the development of like noise barriers that you see at the side of roads now, you know, maybe 2 metre high solid wood or plastic panels, because they help contain that. So that is one point definitely where there has been an effect. Cycling, you'd be interested to know, a lot of people don't think we spoke about cycling before 1990, but in the highway plan there is actually mention of improving the environment for cyclists as well, getting traffic off those surface streets and freeing it up for pedestrians and you know, and actually from a heavy goods vehicle point of view, if you go to Glasgow city centre any time of day, it's very rare that you see a 44-ton vehicle in the city. If you go to Edinburgh, you'll see them trundling up, you know, not Princes Street, but the one at the back, George Street, you know, they're always there. In Glasgow, we're fortunate we can keep that type of traffic away from the central area. And you know, the areas that probably benefit the most, Alexandra Parade, Edinburgh Road, and Paisley West, because they were really badly affected prior to that, you know. But yeah, it's a good point. That is one. I might actually do some looking into that. There will be UK studies done, I imagine. Yeah. Any more? I'm not sure what time we're on. Are we okay for time?
Sorry if everyone knows.
Okay.
Sorry if everyone knows this. You mentioned a cap at Charing Cross. Is that covering the motorway over?
Yeah, so there is a small section covered over at Charing Cross already. The underpass that was put in originally as part of the construction was done for the same reason that they're looking at now. What they're looking to do is extend it by like 100 metres towards Bath Street. So where you've got Tay House coming over, you know, the motorway emerges from the underpass. They're looking to pull that on a bit, reduce the widths of some of the traffic lanes above at the side of the motorway, put in some more active travel facilities, and on that extra cap, I think they're going to put some vegetation, some landscape and that sort of thing, just to try and cover over a bit more of it. I'm sure in an ideal scenario, they would probably like to cover all the way around, you know, to Anderston and all the way perhaps around to Woodside, but the nature of what's there and the cost of that probably makes it prohibitively expensive. You know, there is some good information on the Glasgow City Council website on that. Have a wee look. They've made an application for levelling up fund money to the UK government. So I think they're looking to get that. So hopefully they'll get that and we can see where we end up. I'm not one here.
We've seen some issues with the Kingston Bridge and lengthy repairs and that, and now we've got them on the Woodside Viaduct. Is there a risk that the end of the M8 through Glasgow won't be brought about by political means, but by structural ones?
I answer carefully because professionally I'm involved in that side of things. What I will say is no. The UK is renowned for its inspection regimes, right? That's why we have restrictions, because we're so aware of what our structures are like and the condition of them. And that's why we're able to make these decisions ahead of other places in the world where there are major issues. So like at Woodside, for example, where problems have been found, they're being rectified very quickly. Kingston Bridge was a phenomenal project. They lifted the entire bridge, moved it 30 centimetres and sat it down on new stilts. Kingston came about because they didn't have a full understanding of the design. They had no computers to analyse what they did. It was only when it actually started to get used and traffic started to use it and it got loaded that they started to have issues. And they would then had to come back in and deal with it. Woodside's a different detail, lots of information online. But in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when we had no computers to aid with structural engineering design, the engineers tended to provide short spans, and at short spans you get openings, and where you've got openings you get water through. What do we have in Scotland? Cold temperatures. What do? We salt the road. What do we get? Salty water. Salty water and steel, concrete, never a good mix. 50 years later you're going to have problems, and that's why a lot of these problems come about. It's a well understood problem. We're actually kind of fortunate in Scotland. We don't have just so many of those as they have down south. Across the wider UK, that. But we don't have too many. But I would say that I would go online, Transport Scotland's site, or the Amy Southwest Trunk Roads, maintain the roads on Transport Scotland's behalf. You'll find a lot of information on there as well about what's happening, when it's happening, what they're doing. Some real videos as well, actually, some time-lapse photography and stuff like that on there. So if anybody is interested, I would have a look. Yeah. Any more?
I was wondering if you could touch on the kind of social and cultural impact of having a motorway, splitting the city, and touch on that. I know there's lots to talk about, but
obviously, not being young enough to remember a time before they were old enough to remember a time when the motorway wasn't there. It's difficult to say. So, in my conversations with some of the engineers who were involved in the design, like John Cullen and some of the other chaps who were involved at that point, they always made the point that none of the areas immediately adjacent to the motorway have become ghettos or deprived or undesirable places to be. So thinking about Charing Cross in particular, where you've got flats and new flats that were built at Garnet Hill, they were sold for like 250,000 20 years ago. They're all fully occupied, all the flats are occupied, the shops, the businesses are all still there. Townhead was built as a whole new area, lots of people still in there. Cowcaddens, which I believe is the most successful of the 1970s developments, has a waiting list of people to get into it. So from that point of view, for people don't necessarily not want to live or work or stay next to the motorway. That problem hasn't come about. But there are other issues such as the noise, the emissions, and other things that have come about due to the increases in traffic. And had perhaps they built the rest of the system, that's me speaking as a traffic engineer, the impact would have been far less because the traffic would have been far more spread across a far larger area, So it's like we were trying to stop traffic, going from Greenock to Stirling, coming through Glasgow city centre. But it still kind of is by going around the M8. Had we built the Maryhill Motorway, the North Link Motorway, that traffic would have been able to skirt around the outer edge of the city in a way without getting anywhere near. So it's all these other decisions that have come as part of that. We have an incomplete system, and that has all factored in. So yeah, there are some things that don't imply there were a direct impact because it's all still occupied. Apparently next to some of the freeways in America, a lot of the areas very quickly descended into ghettos and horrible places to be. That hasn't happened in Glasgow. There's no denying that. And people still build next to the motorway, and people still build, buy expensive flats next to it. So, yeah, socially, I don't think it's affecting people's choices too much.
Okay, I think maybe there are a few more questions, but we'll have to wrap up there. I don't know if you're hanging about, Stuart.
I'll hang about for a wee bit at the end if anybody wants to come and ask me any questions directly, or indeed if you want to email them in, you can do as well. You'll find the address on the website.
Okay, please join me in thanking Stuart Baird, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We have two other events happening in here today. I'm going to be giving a wee presentation next about a community heritage project called My Historic Neighbourhood, and that's at 1:30. And then at 2:03, we have a presentation about this building from the team at the Arc. So you'd be more than welcome to come and join us for that. Otherwise, the Open Buildings programme, the WAT programme, is underway now. There are lots of buildings that you can get into without a reservation, so please have a look at the programme and look at that no booking required category, and make sure to check the website for the opening times and opening days because they do vary from building to building. Thank you, everyone.